What kind of man smashes his own can film festival trophies in a fireplace, disappears at the height of his success, and re-emerges decades later as a cult icon only to walk away again? Is that defiance or self-destruction? Is it a cry for freedom or a symptom of a deeper fracture that fame itself can't fix? Dean Stockwell didn't just act in Hollywood. He haunted it. Welcome to Celeb Shadows TV, where we dig past the glitz to uncover what the headlines never dared to tell you. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one actor's rise and fall. It's about a haunting truth hidden inside the Hollywood machine and why some stars would rather vanish than burn. Let's start with a single moment. A drunken night in the 1960s. A young man, barely 29, standing in front of a fireplace. In his hands, two golden trophies from the kind of recognition that cements a career. He looks at them. Then, without a word, throws them into the fire. Gone. Just like that. That man was Dean Stockwell, a child prodigy who dazzled 1940s audiences with soulful eyes and flawless timing. A teenage heartthrob who quit Hollywood cold at 16. And a wandering spirit who'd rather pump gas under a fake name than live under studio contracts. The industry called him difficult. The tabloids wrote him off. Some directors thought he had died. But Dean Stockwell hadn't died. He'd escaped. Repeatedly. He stepped away from Hollywood not once, not twice, but 3 times in his life. Each time, it wasn't because he failed, but because something inside him recoiled from the very idea of success as Hollywood defined it. What kind of person becomes a movie star at 9, supports his entire family by 10, and by 16 wants nothing more than acne and awkwardness just to be left alone? What kind of artist turns his back on Orson Welles? And the promise of leading man glory to live among hippies in Topanga Canyon? Dean Stockwell didn't just walk away from fame. He tried to erase himself from the script. But Hollywood, like any ghost story, doesn't let go so easily. When David Lynch spotted him decades later in a Mexico City cafeteria, preparing for Dune, he blinked and said, "I thought you were dead." Stockwell just smiled. Because in a way, he had been at least to the world that once tried to own him. This story is more than a biography. It's a case study in rebellion. A meditation on what happens when a young soul is shaped by an industry that doesn't ask who you are, only what you can produce. It's also a question for us. What do we owe the people we turn into icons? And what do they lose in the process? As we peel back the layers of Stockwell's life, the prodigy, the dropout, the bohemian, the villain, the sidekick, the ghost, we invite you to think deeper. This isn't just about one man. It's about the price of survival in a place that feeds on dreams but rarely allows you to wake up. So take a breath. Set aside your assumptions. Because everything you thought you knew about Dean Stockwell is about to get flipped inside out. And it starts, not with his movies, but with the silence between them. The silence between Dean Stockwell's public appearances wasn't empty. It was filled with restless steps, unfinished rebellions, and a growing hunger for identity beyond the lens. To understand how this actor could vanish so convincingly and so many times, we have to rewind, not just to his career, but to the system that built him. Dean Stockwell was born in 1936 in North Hollywood, the son of a Broadway baritone and a vaudeville actress. It sounds glamorous, but it was more prophecy than privilege. Hollywood wasn't just nearby, it was in the walls of his childhood home. His father had been the singing voice of Prince Charming in Disney's first animated feature. His mother? A comedian who knew exactly how unforgiving a spotlight could be. By age 7, Dean and his older brother Guy were cast in a Broadway play. A talent scout spotted him, and within months, MGM had signed Dean to a contract. He was just a child, but in the studio's eyes, he was already a product. not a person in development, but a talent to be shaped, packaged, and sold. Dean was enrolled in the infamous Little Red Schoolhouse at MGM, a grooming ground for child actors like Elizabeth Taylor. At 9, he was in films. At 10, he was supporting his entire family. By 12, he was starring in The Boy with Green Hair, a film about a war orphan whose hair turns green, a metaphor for difference, for trauma, for being marked by history. That metaphor? It wasn't fiction. It was Dean. Directors praised his ability to cry on cue. But what they called talent, he remembered as training through psychological torment. Think of a dying puppy. One director told him, moments before a take. And so he did, over and over. It's easy to forget what happens to a child told that their tears are valuable only when they're perfectly timed. By the time he was a teenager, he had one goal: to become ugly. He prayed for acne. He slouched his posture. He hoped the camera would stop loving him, just so the world might let him be a boy again. When his contract expired at 16, Dean Stockwell didn't throw a party. He disappeared. He cut his hair. He left the business. He enrolled in a public high school. He took odd jobs. He hitchhiked across the country. He pumped gas under an alias. For most of the 1950s, no one in Hollywood knew where he was, and that's exactly how he wanted it. This was his first disappearance. But it wasn't a breakdown. It was an act of self-rescue. After a childhood turned into performance, he was trying, for the first time, to experience life without the stage. But reality crept in. Dean had no other trade. By the mid-1950s, he realized the only thing he truly knew how to do was act. And so, with cautious steps, he returned not to Hollywood, but to the theater stage in New York. And just like that, the industry welcomed him back not as a child, but as a brooding young adult. He starred in Compulsion, a psychological thriller based on the infamous Leopold and Loeb murder case. When it was adapted into a film, he reprised his role alongside Orson Welles. King gave him the Best Actor prize, a rare shared award, and suddenly, the prodigy was a serious actor. More accolades followed. Sons and Lovers in 1960. Long Day's Journey into Night in 1962, another can triumph. On paper, Dean had done the impossible, escaped the child star curse. But behind the scenes, the old discontent returned. He married actress Millie Perkins. It lasted 2 years. She cited emotional turmoil. He withdrew again. Not physically, but emotionally. Something about the spotlight still burned. Then came the infamous moment, the fireplace, the trophies, the drunken act of rebellion. Because even when he was winning, Dean didn't feel like he belonged. The next disappearance was more radical. As the counterculture of the 60s erupted, Stockwell didn't just observe, he dissolved into it. He left behind the suits and scripts and found refuge in Topanga Canyon, Haight-Ashbury, and the creative communes of California. He grew his hair, took psychedelics, hung out with Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, Neil Young. They weren't just party friends. They were kindred misfits. Artists unfit for polite society. Rebels with no interest in redemption. Dean acted occasionally in trippy, indie, hallucinogenic films like Psych Out and The Last Movie. But for over a decade, he was more legend than presence. A name whispered, a memory half forgotten. Hollywood had moved on. And in a way, so had he. But history has a strange way of circling back to those it once forgot. History may forget people, but Hollywood has a longer memory when it comes to control. And Dean Stockwell's return in the 1980s didn't just shock the industry because of his talent. It reopened questions about the system he had rejected and the strange web of relationships that both nurtured and tormented him across decades. To understand Dean's repeated withdrawals, we need to examine not only who he was, but who surrounded him. First, the family. His father, Harry Stockwell lent his voice to Prince Charming, yet never reached that same princely success himself. His mother, a vaudeville actress, raised her sons on stages instead of playgrounds. Childhood wasn't a phase, it was a business. Their living depended on Dean. That's not pressure. That's indentured performance. When he cried on screen, it wasn't just acting. It was economic survival. Dean's older brother, Guy Stockwell, also became an actor, but unlike many Hollywood siblings, theirs wasn't a public rivalry. Guy seemed to understand Dean's resentment toward the business. In interviews, Dean often avoided naming names, but when he did, it was clear that even family love couldn't undo the damage of a commodified childhood. Then came the network of fellow outsiders, the ones who didn't demand performance but offered space. Dennis Hopper was one of the few who saw Dean at his worst and stayed, a fellow wanderer. Hopper never flinched at Dean's volatility. When Hollywood closed its doors, Hopper invited Dean into a new world: experimental film, psychedelia, radical art. No scripts, no agents, just chaos and possibility. Their bond wasn't based on career advantage. It was rooted in shared damage. Both had been chewed up by the machine. Both knew what it was to self-destruct in plain sight. And yet, Dean also found his way into circles that didn't just reflect rebellion, they channeled it. Neil Young, Jack Nicholson, Russ Tamblyn, the so-called freak clique of Hollywood's fringe. These weren't people chasing awards. They were chasing escape, reinvention, sometimes destruction. And Dean fit in perfectly, not as a mascot, but as a mirror. But the most curious relationship of all may have been with David Lynch. When Lynch encountered Stockwell in the early 80s, he was casting for Dune. He thought Stockwell was dead. Literally. It's a surreal thing to say to a man. And yet, somehow fitting. Because Dean had spent a decade in artistic purgatory, not working, not wanting to be seen, drifting through New Mexico, even trying his hand at real estate. Lynch didn't just give him a role. He gave him a resurrection. Later, in Blue Velvet, Lynch gave Stockwell a moment, just one scene. One eerie, unforgettable scene that became iconic. But that's not the full story. On set, Dean picked up a handheld work light, not part of the plan, and turned it into a microphone. Lip-syncing Roy Orbison's In Dreams. Improvised. No direction. No script. Just instinct. And it was perfect. That was the essence of Dean Stockwell, a man who thrived when unchained, when allowed to create, rather than perform. But beyond individuals, we must also look at the institution. MGM shaped Dean as a child. And that model, the contract player system, was unforgiving. Children were trained like circus acts: perform, deliver, repeat. Behind the camera, tutors with studio agendas. Off-set, press tours, photo ops, moral clauses. There was no off switch. Dean never forgot this. It's why, even as an adult actor, he remained suspicious of producers, contracts, managers. Trust was a currency he couldn't afford to spend. Even in later interviews, he admitted he never quite felt safe in the industry. Not because of competition, but because of control. The idea that someone else owned your image, your voice, your schedule. It echoed his childhood, and it never stopped echoing. There's another undercurrent here, one rarely named aloud in celebrity lore: post-traumatic response. Dean may not have used those words, but his behaviors spoke volumes. Repeated disappearances, identity shifts, artist therapy, destruction of awards. These weren't tantrums. They were symptoms. And still, when the doors opened again, he stepped back through. Not because he craved attention, but because, ironically, acting was the one thing that gave him autonomy. When done on his own terms, he didn't need Hollywood to love him. He just needed it to leave him alone long enough to be himself. To understand Dean Stockwell's relationship with fame, you have to stop thinking of it as a career and start thinking of it as a wound. Because for Dean, success didn't heal anything. It reopened everything he'd tried to bury. There's a moment that still haunts people who knew him. A private gathering in the early 60s. Dean had just returned from Cannes. He had another trophy in his hands. And after a few drinks, he made a toast to the illusion of arrival. Then he dropped the award into a trash bin and left without saying another word. Why? That's the question that keeps surfacing. Why sabotage what so many would kill for? We often talk about self-sabotage in celebrities like it's impulsive, irresponsible. But what if it's not that simple? What if it's the only way to reclaim control from a system that keeps rewriting your story without asking? Dean's entire life had been scripted by others. His tears, his clothes, his schedule, even his silence was often interpreted for him. So when he took the pen back, when he wrote his own narrative through refusal, it looked like rebellion. But really, it was survival. Fame, for Dean, was never about validation. It was about violation. Think about that. Every time the world applauded, a part of him flinched. Because applause meant being seen, and being seen had never been safe. This is why, at his peak, Dean would often retreat into absurdity. He would play characters that mocked the very idea of identity, psychedelic gurus, bizarre criminals, offbeat weirdos. He would exaggerate, satirize, disappear into caricature, not because he lacked range, but because it was the only way to hide in plain sight. Take his performance in Blue Velvet. He shows up for one scene. No exposition. No backstory. Just presence. He lip-syncs into a work lamp like it's a sacred ritual. He wears white pancake makeup, a velvet jacket, a smirk that never touches his eyes. It's eerie, stylized, unforgettable. But look closer, it's not just acting. It's commentary on performance, on masks, on what it means to be watched. Or look at his Oscar-nominated role in Married to the Mob. He's cartoonish, over the top, reveling in parody, a mafia boss straight out of a fever dream. And yet, under the surface, there's an ache, a knowingness, as if the character is in on the joke and wants you to know that the joke is really on all of us for believing in types, in roles, in myths. That's the pattern with Dean. Every time Hollywood tried to welcome him back, he accepted the invitation but rearranged the furniture. He never played the game straight. He bent genres. He turned tropes inside out. He made himself too strange to forget, but too slippery to define. And this wasn't just strategy. It was emotional armor. The truth is, Dean Stockwell didn't fear failure. He feared being trapped by success. Because success came with expectations of consistency, of stability, of smiling when told. And Dean had learned as a child what it meant to smile on cue. So instead, he made himself uncontainable. He was the quantum actor here and gone, solid and vapor, present but impossible to pin down. And that, paradoxically, made him essential, not to the industry, but to a certain kind of viewer. The viewer who sees through the curtain, who understands that not all ghosts wear chains. There's another layer here, too. One we don't often acknowledge in celebrity stories: depression. Dean never openly spoke of it, but the signs were there. The long silences, the drifting, the refusal to chase what others chase. The way he spoke about his early fame not with pride, but with grief. And maybe grief is the real word here. Dean Stockwell didn't lose a career. He lost a childhood. And every comeback was a kind of elegy, a return to the scene of the theft. He once said, "The 1960s let me have the childhood I never got." That wasn't a throwaway line. It was a thesis. While others saw the counterculture as rebellion, Dean saw it as repair. He wasn't just dropping acid or dancing barefoot in Topanga for shock value. He was healing. through chaos, through community, through the unstructured. And yet, even there he couldn't stay. Because Dean Stockwell was a man of motion. Always escaping the frame he'd just entered. Always vanishing before the applause got too loud. Always stepping out of sync with the narrative others wrote for him. Some called him erratic. Others called him difficult. But maybe he was just unwilling to let his life be flattened into a headline. Maybe he knew that the real tragedy in Hollywood isn't failure, it's surrender. And Dean Stockwell never surrendered. Dean Stockwell never chased the spotlight. And yet, in one of Hollywood's most ironic twists, it came roaring back to him not through film, but through television, a medium he never truly trusted. In an era when crossing from film to TV was still seen as a step down. But what happened next didn't just rewrite Dean's career. It reframed how millions of Americans saw him. It began in 1989 with a show called Quantum Leap. At the time, Stockwell had just come off a wave of film roles that re-established his relevance: Blue Velvet, Married to the Mob, Beverly Hills Cop 2, and more. His name was back on casting lists. Directors had rediscovered what made him magnetic. But instead of doubling down on movies, Dean took a leap of faith into primetime network television. To many of his friends, it felt like a betrayal. Dennis Hopper reportedly said, "Well, that's the end of his career." And he wasn't alone. In the late 80s, prestige actors didn't do weekly network shows. The big screen was where real legitimacy lived. Television, especially sci-fi, was seen as genre ghetto. But Dean didn't care. Or maybe he saw something the others didn't. Quantum Leap was a strange hybrid, part science fiction, part morality tale, part existential drama. The concept was simple but flexible. A man travels through time by leaping into the bodies of strangers, fixing historical mistakes. Scott Bakula played the leaper, and Dean played Al, the cigar-chomping, womanizing hologram who guided him. It sounds absurd, and in many ways, it was. But that absurdity masked something deeply humane. Al was the comic relief: loud suits, snappy lines, offbeat energy. But Dean gave him layers: sadness, regret, vulnerability. As the show deepened, we learned Al had been a prisoner of war, that he had lost the love of his life, that behind the swagger was a man quietly grieving. And in one unforgettable episode, Sam rewrites time so Al and his lost love get a second chance. The look on Dean's face in that scene, it was everything. A masterclass in understated emotion. It earned him a Golden Globe in 1990 for Emmy nominations. And something more valuable than trophies, a new kind of recognition. Not from the industry, but from people. Quantum Leap aired for 5 seasons, 97 episodes. And each week, a new audience, many of whom had never heard of the boy with green hair or Can or David Lynch, fell in love with Dean Stockwell. Not the eccentric actor, the steady friend, the wisecracking hologram who always showed up. For Dean, this was a kind of homecoming. Not because television was comfortable, but because it was honest. Episodic work gave him structure. The role gave him humor. And for once, he didn't have to vanish to protect himself. He could just show up. And America responded. Fan letters, convention invites, college students dressing as Al for Halloween. A generation of viewers grew up seeing Dean not as a ghost from cinema's golden age, but as a vibrant, vital part of their cultural memory. Critics softened, too. They stopped calling him mercurial and started calling him iconic. He wasn't just a survivor. He was proof that reinvention didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it just meant sticking around long enough to be rediscovered. Of course, Hollywood still didn't quite know what to do with him. Even after Quantum Leap, he bounced between roles, playing everything from judges to villains to satirical versions of himself. But none of it felt desperate. Dean had already proven he didn't need to climb. He just needed to move. He popped up in The Player, The Rainmaker, Jag, Stargate, Enterprise, and most memorably, Battlestar Galactica, as Brother Cavil, a villainous Cylon. Dean leaned into his age and ambiguity. He made menace intellectual, charisma unsettling. Fans of the show, many of whom had never seen Quantum Leap, were once again captivated. And Dean, ever the shapeshifter, slipped into yet another cult corner of pop culture. There's something poetic about that. A man who once fled the fame of cinema found quiet immortality in genre television, not by chasing relevance, but by becoming timeless in his own offbeat way. Because Dean Stockwell wasn't interested in being the biggest. He just wanted to matter on his terms. Looking back on Dean Stockwell's later years, what stands out most isn't his continued work, although that, in itself, was impressive, but rather the quiet clarity with which he stepped away from the industry. Unlike many actors of his era who clung to relevance or chased legacy roles, Dean walked away when he was ready. No farewell tour, no dramatic curtain call, just a graceful exit, as enigmatic and composed as the man himself. His final on-screen appearances came in the early 2010s. They weren't blockbusters or award-bait projects, but that was never the point. Dean showed up for work like he always had, reliably, fully, and without ego. And then, when his health began to decline following a stroke in 2015, he did something most actors fear. He stopped. He didn't need to announce it. There was no Instagram post or tearful interview. He simply retired, moved to Taos, New Mexico, a place as eccentric and spiritual as he was, and lived quietly with his family, painting, reflecting, breathing. In a culture obsessed with comebacks and reinventions, his stillness felt almost revolutionary. Dean Stockwell passed away on November 7th, 2021, at the age of 85. And when the news broke, it wasn't splashed across every major outlet. There was no media circus. But for those who knew, it hit hard. Social media quietly flooded with tributes, fans, actors, critics, all sharing the same sentiment. Dean had been part of their lives in ways they hadn't fully realized until he was gone. Some remembered him as Al from Quantum Leap, others as the unsettling Dr. You from Dune, or the terrifying Ben in Blue Velvet. Some dug deeper back to his child actor days, recalling his wide eyes in Anchors Away, or his haunting presence in Gentleman's Agreement. A few even mentioned his 1960s dropout phase, marveling at how many versions of Dean Stockwell the world had actually witnessed. And yet, for all those incarnations, the core remained the same. Dean was never acting to please others. He wasn't chasing brand building or legacy. He was simply, unapologetically, himself. Every role was a negotiation between presence and mystery. Every performance a balancing act between revealing too much and not enough. In this way, Dean embodied a kind of Hollywood that no longer exists, not the glamorous, studio-polished machine of his childhood, but the rebellious, searching, uncertain Hollywood of the 1970s and 80s. A place where oddballs had a shot, where the rules could bend, where someone like Dean, with his contradictions, his convictions, his refusal to be categorized, could not only survive, but influence generations of storytellers. What does his legacy tell us? It tells us that fame isn't the same as impact. That enduring talent doesn't have to shout. That quiet rebellion, walking away, redefining success, saying no to the expected, can be just as powerful as any red carpet moment. Dean Stockwell wasn't a saint. He could be prickly, aloof, contradictory. He drifted in and out of the system with equal parts disdain and grace. He wasn't always understood. But maybe that's the point. True artists rarely are. What matters is that he kept showing up, not for applause, but for the work. Not to be remembered, but to stay real. And perhaps that's why his story resonates now more than ever. In an age where celebrity is constant performance, where actors are expected to share, confess, stream, reveal, Dean Stockwell is a reminder that mystery is still magnetic, that you don't have to sell yourself to be seen, that authenticity, especially when paired with restraint, can carve a space more lasting than viral fame. He made room for himself. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask to be liked. And in doing so, he gave a generation of misfits, artists, introverts, and outsiders a strange kind of permission to exist on your own terms. That is the tragedy and the triumph of Dean Stockwell. Not that he disappeared, but that he was never quite here in the way Hollywood wanted him to be. And maybe that's why we remember him not as a superstar, not as a martyr, but as something far more enduring. The ghost who haunted Hollywood not with scandal, but with dignity. A man who passed through our screens with mystery in his eyes and silence in his soul, and somehow left a louder echo than anyone shouting for the spotlight ever could. So in the end, what are we really left with when someone like Dean Stockwell slips quietly out of this world? Not scandal, not spectacle, not a perfectly curated legacy, but questions. Questions about the price of identity in an industry built on illusions. About the cost of stepping away when the world demands you stay on stage. About what it truly means to live a life that is both watched and hidden. Perhaps the deeper tragedy isn't that Dean Stockwell faded from the spotlight, but that we, as a culture, are so uncomfortable with the idea of someone choosing to disappear. Choosing authenticity over fame. Choosing silence over attention. And maybe that's the uncomfortable truth, that in a world obsessed with visibility, the most radical act is to walk away without explanation. Dean Stockwell didn't demand to be understood. But maybe that's what makes him worth remembering. Not because he fit the mold, but because he didn't care to. Not because he was always present, but because he knew exactly when to leave. So, the question lingers, long after the lights fade. In our rush to be seen, are we forgetting how to simply be? Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey into the quiet brilliance and haunting legacy of a man who never shouted to be heard. Subscribe to Tragedy Uncovered so you never miss a single truth hidden beneath the surface. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and we'll see you soon.